I'm going to be preaching. This is, for those of you that were here at the very beginning, this is the third part in a 5-part preaching series on the James Luther Adams ethics. But I'm going to begin with a story, as I often do, and find my way around back to the actual message. When I was still living in Brooklyn, this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we had a small garden that wrapped around our terrace. Think herbs and some wildflowers and grasses. When the weather was nice, I would write my sermons outside. From there, it's probably why I have so many in my sermons messages that are coming from nature. My dog would lay down in the shade of one of the flower boxes, and my cat gets the proverbial popcorn and watches the Nature Channel in my garden. Everything is extremely fascinating to our cat, Toby. He'll stare at ants like they are alien creatures, but won't get too close or engage. Bees, on the other hand, turn him into a veritable jerk. He'll stalk them and swipe at them if they linger too long on a flower. At first, I was horrified, without a clue as to what to do about it. I have a mild allergy to bees, so I'm not going to get too close to intervene, but they also don't deserve that fate before the claws of my cat. In another feat of dog training magic, I figured out how to train our dog to tackle the cat when he goes for the bees. It was based off an earlier lesson of when my cat would start scratching the furniture. Basically, we've trained our dog to tackle small cats on command without hurting them. I think it's fun for everyone, really, but I'm sure the bee appreciates it as much as the couch does, I dare say more so. Enough times being tackled by the dog, the cat becomes increasingly hesitant to swipe at bees. It doesn't stop him, though, from swiping at our furniture. I can't have everything, I guess. So that's a long intro to bees are interesting creatures. The common wisdom is that they defy the laws of aerodynamics in order to fly with their wings that should be too light for their bodies to get lift. But they still do. They live cloistered away with several thousand of their closest family members. They work tirelessly so that the next generation, which they may not live to see, can be born in another season. How many millions of worker bees hours does it take to produce one jar of honey for our toast or our tea? Then they return again and again to the field to gather more and more food for the honeycombed table. From the perspective of us humans in the Northeast, they're gone for half the year, isolated from the cold and inclement weather. Even raindrops can be a challenge when you're that small. When I water my garden, even the one that I live in now out in Jersey, they head for the hills. Then as the weather turns to spring and summer, they fly back out of seeming isolation and live fully in the wider world. Food and garden hoses and allergic bystanders, and yes, even my psycho killer felines are here to greet them as they return. It's a microcosm of the world we live in, and just as true. And we have to be as cautious and attentive as we're coming out of isolation in the wider political landscape of our nation. We all have our times of quiet, introversion, rest, and renewal in between the periods of work and study. For the bee, it's the call of physical nourishment that brings them out of their quasi-isolation from the world. No matter how much we hunker down, at some point the reserves run dry and it's time to go back out for connection again. This year, Reverend Peggy, our senior minister, will continue to lead us in imagining what would it mean to be a people of covenant. Maybe you know the word covenant mostly from Jewish and Christian and Muslim stories about God and God's people. That understanding is about the promises we are given and the promises that we are held to in light of the demands and support given to us by God in those stories. But for today, I want to focus more on what promise is held in covenant with one another, community and covenant draws us out of loneliness and into a shared humanity that defines our lives. In UU congregations, churches, societies, fellowships, one thing is almost universally true, despite all our differences. The essence of the covenant centers around our desire to be accountable to one another. In a secular world where consumerism and convenience trumps a sense of common ethic, of mutual support, it's imperative for religious communities to stretch out to and within one another to build the common good. Covenant is about building the common good, or what Martin Luther King Jr. commonly referred to as the beloved community, a phrase we recite every Sunday as part of our services. Last Sunday, I spoke at length about the theology of James Luther Adams and his concepts of the 5 stones. In short, for those that have missed those, he was looking at a story of David and Goliath in the Jewish scripture and reflecting on what those 5 stones David used in the sling to take down the giant, or in modern language, to combat oppression. In the next 2 weeks, we'll do the 4th and the 5th stone to close it out, and this week it's the 3rd stone. We have an obligation, this is the paraphrase of the teaching, we have an obligation to work toward creating a beloved community. Our faith inspires us to the work of transformational community that is centered in justice and love. The prophethood of all believers has a corrective effect on systems of oppression. As I paraphrase it, community has a corrective effect on systems of oppressions. Theologically, covenant is the antithesis of oppression. We enter freely into community relations. You only build a covenant when our folks come to it with equal footing. And when we have equal footing, we can hold one another accountable from an equal place. So when I talk here about someone falling out of covenant, we're talking about a situation in our congregation, our church, where one person is leveraging their individual power or their feelings over and beyond that shared agreement of how we work together collaboratively. It's referring to a situation where the individual ego is leading over another person's worth or another person's pain. And to be fair, we all fall for the tricks of the ego. Falling short of our covenant doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means that you've let your ego run before the rest of us, before all of us. And that's something we do all the time, from time to time. We all do it. It's human, and it's our quintessential challenge to overcome as humans. As UUs, we choose to face that challenge together publicly, and to do that together publicly fosters some awkward moments. So when we fall for it and someone points it out, try to hear it with love and begin again and again. It's being human at our best. Last week, I also spoke about demands that our faith places upon us in relationship to those precepts, those stones. The match demand to this 3rd precept would be the theological question: does this thing or value before us seek to bring more harmony and more equity in our relationships, even if the work is very difficult? What does that mean, though, in the everyday language? When we're trying to decide on an action or a belief or a value or an angered reply to something someone says or does in our community, the essential question follows: does our response bring more harmony and equity to our relationship, or does it bring more discord? If the answer is yes to the harmony and equity, not the discord, great. If the answer is no, then we are straying from the religious path our faith challenges us to adhere to. When we ask ourselves if our response or actions bring more harmony or equity And the answer is no, we're falling prey to our lone ego. The domain of the ego is isolation, and community calls us out from that lonely place. I believe that progressive faith calls us out of isolation to do much in the world, but it also calls us out of isolation to spiritually mature, past or through our attachment to ego. And it's in that mattering, though, through our attachment to ego, that we are also begin to do much good in the world. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this in the broader world. We're talking about a community, a congregation that is chosen to be in relationship to one another. And sometimes when we step in each other's toes or we fall short of the covenant we've agreed to with each other, it can really feel like a personal attack, or it can feel like someone's being chastised. In most of our religious education programs across the country, the kids are raised with this from pre-K, and they come up with a group of values in their covenant they hold each other to, and they're raised that when someone slips up, to pause and bring them back in. And I think often in our spaces, when we're not raised with that mindset, we start to think of it as sort of a legal system, and rather than shared values and how to be in community. And as we look into the wider world right now, there's, on the extreme end, we're way past covenant when you're getting to a legal situation. And this is one of the things that I worry. James Luther Adams had his start in trying to combat fascism in Europe, as the rise of Nazism in Europe. And all of these ethical decisions about community were set up to help train us on how to be in relationship with one another, so that we don't get to a point where we're putting faith in tyrants. We're learning how to be humans with each other. And it's so appropriate today as it was 100 years ago when he was writing these things, where the rule of law is breaking down in our nation. And we may not individually be able to resolve what's happening in our government, but what we're doing in these congregations of ours is training the next generation and the next generation on how to be conscious about how to live in an ethical way that supports democracy's highest ideals around justice seeking, rather than allowing people to isolate, go into bubbles of hearing the same political information, not having a conversation with someone they disagree with. And it leads to scary places. And we're not immune to it as UUs. I've had congregants in my past fellowship fall into one of those bubbles. And it started with vaccination information and then fell into somewhere further and further conservative. Even though they're raised, I shouldn't say conservative, I should say leaning toward accepting fascism is what I should say. Because there are conservatives that are not leaning toward accepting fascism, and that's an extreme. But it is frightening in this day and age where someone or people that I know who've raised their kids to adulthood in UU spaces can fall prey to that. And that's what honoring a covenant means, that we help each other to come back into right relationship before we get to a spot where we're so isolated that we're not the same person we used to be. Often in UU spaces, to come to a close, we sometimes joke that we can believe anything. I don't agree with that. And if you think I'm wrong, then next week let's plan for me to preach about whatever I personally feel like and see how well that goes over. And it's not going to go well. There's things I can't preach from a pulpit because we can't always. We can't believe anything. We're not about belief, but we have central values that are very specific, even if we don't always see it. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll be exploring together what demands our theology places on us, our actions in the world as UUs, as religious people, of faithful purpose, however those words mean to you. Demand that we act so that we mature, we nurture harmony and equity in human relations. That is core value for us. When we act from anger or ego, we're being very human, but we're falling short of our theological convictions. We're not evil for doing it necessarily, but we have fallen short, and our faith calls us out, it calls us back in, and it calls for more of us. Amen, and blessed be.